What was the hardest piece of news you've had to tell someone? I worked as a pediatric psychology fellow while in graduate school, PhD clinical psychology. This involved providing psychological services for all children in the hospital. One of my very first weeks I was shadowing a more experienced fellow and we encountered a family whose child, 7-year-old, was hospitalized after she was in a car accident with her father. Her father died in the accident and no one in her family was comfortable directly explaining this to the child. They had used a lot of religious euphemisms about death. He's watching over you in heaven. He's with you in spirit, but this language is not concrete enough for a young child who doesn't really understand death. Sitting with this child, body brace, lacerations all over, very flat affect, and explaining to her what death was. That her father had died. And having to ask questions to make sure she understood was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my graduate training. I can still vividly imagine her face while we were telling her and the tears silently rolling down her face. I had to tell my boyfriend his best friend was the body found in the river after he had been missing for 2 days. Had to call my girlfriend parents at 1 AM to tell them there was a bad accident. That their daughter was en route to ER and I thought she would be okay. She died on arrival. Worst day of my life. To tell my mom her husband had been molesting me for multiple years and that I wasn't going back into her house. Had to call my brother, sisters, and mother when I found my father dead. After calling 911 and my wife. I've told the story before but I was a NIC paramedic and had to walk a guy through his own death one night. He was crushed and folded by a subway car. As soon as we moved the subway car we knew he would bleed out. He had no family to call. I suspect it had something to do with his sexuality, and I'm a huge believer that no one dies alone. I had FDNY and the MTA set up a spot so I could crawl under the car next to him and we could talk as the process happened. I gave him plenty of morphine and he took my hand as the lift was started. I didn't let go till I pronounced him. P.S. Tommy. I stayed till we had to close the doors, man. I promised I would. My wife lights that candle for you every anniversary too. No one will ever forget you as long as I have a say. Telling someone's family that we are giving up on searching for their loved ones who are lost at sea. I had to call my friend's girlfriend to let her know he'd been killed in an accident. And then share that news with his best friend on a pursuant call. Definitely telling my grandmother that her daughter, my mother, had just died. Nothing quite prepares you for telling someone about a death. I had to tell my mom that my dad died. 40 years later I had to tell my kids I had cancer. I'm sorry, I should have said I beat it. At least for now. Wow, thank you for silver. So sweet. I had to tell my wife that our 8-year-old son had died in the night. He was on hospice and it was expected but that was still hard. Then I had to phone my older children and tell them. Thursday will mark 2 years. Professionally. I had to tell the parents of a 20-year-old basketball star that his drug use did not account for his unusual thoughts and behaviors, that he was, in fact, psychotic and likely schizophrenic. My brother, who was active military at the time, had to be granted emergency leave for my mother who was on her deathbed after a short but destructive battle with cancer. They took more than 24 hours to sign one name on that document to release him. Even knowing the circumstances. He became noticeably upset that they were taking their time with it. They pulled him aside and threatened to make him undergo a psych evaluation for being, understandably, angry. She died while he was on his flight home. I had to tell him over the phone that he missed the passing of our mom and he wouldn't ever be able to say goodbye. That was rough. Telling my sister that our dad's heart attack was indeed fatal. When my grandmother passed we knew it was coming as she had been ill for a very long time. I was at home with my mom when my aunt called with the news that she was gone. My younger sister was at school so we went to pick her up. When she was called to the office and she saw us there, I think a part of her knew why we came to pick her up. But that didn't make it easier to tell her. telling my 4-year-old his papa had died. Same. He was 4 too when papa died. My husband's parents live behind us, so he was used to going back and forth. He forgot, or I guess didn't understand, and walked out to show papa he had written his letters. He came back with huge tears dripping and sat at the kitchen table saying he just wanted papa to see he could write. When he fixed his eyes on me and said, "I'm drawing a picture of my papa, BC he's dead, I view he's sad mommy. View he's sad." I lost it. One Sunday at church I was walking my baby outside when one of my best friend's mom came up to me. She was in hunting attire and looked to be in complete shock. She told me her husband, my friend's dad, had just fallen out of his tree stand and broken his neck and died. And she asked me to go get her daughter out of church to let her know. It was one of the worst days in my life. I had to tell a doctor that the family decided that it was time to let mom go peacefully. After my wife woke up from a medically induced coma, I had to tell her our son died. The look of soul-shattering pain still bothers me. When I told my dad that he was in the early stage of dying and was moving to hospice care, he told me, "Oh good," because he was so tired of being sick with Parkinson's. He died 2 weeks later. My dad was a cop for 27 years, so I asked him, "Sir, Dad was working the midnight shift. They got a call about a car accident. Arrived on the scene to find a fatality. Turns out the guy who was killed was a police officer's son. He was also a close family friend. My dad had to go to one of his best friend and co-worker's house at like 2 AM to tell him his son had been struck and killed by a drunk driver. I had to tell my girlfriend that her grandmother had passed away. Her mom called me and asked me to break the news to her, since she's terrible at that stuff. We had only been together about a year and I had to leave work to drive over and tell her. She had just come back from visiting her grandmother a few provinces away a few days earlier and the doctors said she would be okay. She was so close with her grandmother, I knew it would be devastating to her. It was. She cried for a few hours. I booked her on the next flight home and helped her pack. To this day, something I'll never forget doing. On the plus side, we are still together almost 7 years later and have a beautiful baby girl. I like to think that the moment brought us closer together. I headed up a few departments at my last job, and as dept head, I had to be the one to fire people in those departments. It always sucks. Even if they are the worst and totally deserve it. Never feels good to take away someone's security. Trying to explain to my 4-year-old niece why my longtime girlfriend wasn't with me anymore. She just didn't understand and kept asking questions like, "I thought auntie loved you? Why did she leave?" The breakup was recent in that conversation. That conversation hurt, man. Tell my dad who had dementia my mother passed away from cancer. I had to tell my spouse and children that my 26-year-old took his own life. I had to tell my mom that the bike that I reported stolen to the police was under the F-kin porch. A friend of mine at university committed suicide. I ended up sitting down with or calling some of our friends, so the first they heard of it wasn't over Facebook or in the news. 18 months on and it still eats away a bit inside. Bar regular of mine almost fell to his death washing windows in a 4-story building. He miraculously survived yet broke every bone in his body and cracked his skull. First responders were firefighters right near Houston Street and Broadway in New York City. If they hadn't responded, he would have died right there. Fast forward 4 weeks later. The 15th of September. 2001. He is out of his coma. And finally able to be taken home by his sister and out of hospice. Barely able to speak, he manages to whisper that he wants her pass him by the fire station 2 blocks down so he could thank his rescuers. His sister had to then explain the black smoke still lingering in the air. The entirety of the 9/11 attacks and that every single first responder that helped him perished. Sometimes that worn out older man sitting at the bar day drinking red wine has a really good story to tell. Broke my heart. Edit. Tie sensitive stranger for my first silver and gold. tell my dad, who was in the hospital 2 weeks away from his own death, that his father had died. Dad hadn't yet accepted that he himself was dying, though my sister and I could see it. Grandpa had been in hospice for 2 months, so we all knew that his end was near. In the week between Grandpa's death and his funeral, Dad began to accept that he didn't have much time left. Dad made it to Grandpa's funeral, albeit via ambulance wheelchair, and saw his extended family for the last time. That was a surreal experience for me, watching him say goodbye. Edit. Not me, but one of my aunts had to tell our family that her husband and kids all died after they hit a moose in their car. The worst part is that the husband got decapitated by a shard of glass from the windscreen, and the kids might have seen it happen before they eventually passed. Semicolon. Edit. Thank you everyone for the kindness. I was very young when it happened, so I don't know all the details. I know the bit at the end is a little horrible, and I hope they didn't have to go through that. I am simply saying what I was told by my family. To answer some questions, my aunt is okay now, although it was very tough for her for many years and it really hurt the family as a whole. Again, thanks to everyone for the kind words, it means the world to me. Mom and her 4-year-old daughter were in a house fire. Mom had 3rd-degree burns over 60% of her body. She was put in a medically induced coma. After extubating the mom a few days later, my roommate, a surgery resident, had to tell her that her daughter was brain dead. I had to tell my best friend one of his fraternity brothers committed suicide. He was out of school for the semester, and I knew informing him wouldn't be the top priority by anyone in the house. So I called him. It was the most heartbreaking thing to have to do, especially over the phone. I wished I could have been there for him in person. I think it was the only time I'd seen him cry. Telling my mom over the phone while she's in the hospital that I just found my dad in bed, passed away. She was in so much denial that he had died. She tried to convince me that maybe he's just doped up on sleeping pills. I wished it were true, but I had already knew he was gone when I tried to move him. Stiff as a board. Paramedics came in and confirmed he died. Mum was on the phone still and heard everything. I never knew heartbreak could have a sound until I heard my mom break down on the phone. I tried to keep my composure, but I ended up having to mute the phone call and let some tears out myself. This was almost 2 years ago. Edit. This is my first Reddit post. Thank you all for the condolences. And thank you so much for the platinum. Tell my mother I was very depressed after she confronted me about a suicide note of mine she found accidentally. Telling my parents that my college girlfriend was pregnant during senior year. It was a rough conversation, but I had built it up in my head that it was going to be far worse. The follow-up conversation about it all having been faked by her was also very hard. Had to tell my parents that my brother took his own life. I still cringe when the phone rings. Edit 1. I was told by the cops over the phone. Edit 2. BTW. Never shy away from asking a loved one if they need help. Avoiding the conversation doesn't make the problem go away. Not talking about it certainly doesn't stop the person from going through with the act. The pain is real and it's there whether we talk about it or not. If you are in pain, please hold on to the thought that you are loved and there are people who care, even if it doesn't seem so. If you can, please reach out for help. This was quite some time ago. One of my co-workers introduced me to my now wife. They were best friends. My co-worker was on her way to work one evening and someone crossed the double yellow and hit her head on, killing her. I received a call from manager informing me of the incident. I had to call my now wife and tell her that her best friend had been killed in a car wreck. This was probably the worst memory of my life. I had to tell my son, not biological, no legal rights to him, that I wanted to divorce his dad. I barely see him now, and he doesn't even consider me his parent anymore. I don't really know how to deal with it. I don't even think I'm supposed to still call him my son. But how do you become a not parent to someone you've parented largely by yourself for 8 years? I had to tell a few friends that our friend Osa, my best friend growing up, Osa killed himself at age 25. Then I and one friend I broke the news to, told her roommate Osa, a girl our departed friend actually dated briefly Osa, and we just didn't have the words, so we started laughing nervously. She thought we were about to tell her a joke and she started laughing too. God, it was awful. It was like our brains couldn't process the task at hand and short-circuited. Total guru meditation. It took a few hours for it all to sink in, and then I cried for days. We all did. Had to call one of my best friends to tell him our other friend was to be taken off life support. And he had to come say goodbye. That was 3 years ago. Still painful, but time heals. While my best friend was away at boot camp, his longtime girlfriend was cheating on him and was being open about it. Had to tell him the night he got home because he was wanting to propose to her. He didn't believe me until I told him how she was sneaking guys into her parents' house, and he said that's how I always snuck in. My best friend that his brother died. My dad found me right after I drank bleach, was 14. Attempted suicide. Had to explain why my room smelled like bleach to a man slowly losing it as he pieced together what was happening while in excruciating pain. Edit: I drank the bleach as a last resort. It wasn't my first attempt, so all other methods had been locked away. I guess nobody expected I'd choose such a horrible way to die. Knives and medication were in locked presses. No good place to hang myself. Didn't want to waste police resources by going off somewhere and drowning myself to never be found again. I was admitted to psych ward. My dad made me chug milk and I dealt with stomach ulcers, but was relatively okay after some time in hospital. More light-hearted, I had to be told that I couldn't be the Cookie Monster. Telling my husband that his mum had died. Telling my brother-in-law that his mum had died, and telling my kids that their grandma had died. Same amazing lady, but 3 different conversations. Awful day. Telling my 10-year-old son that his nonna, my mum, had passed away. Had to call my grandmother's best friend who lives out of province that my grandma passed away. The friend didn't even know my grandma was dying. She declined over the course of a week. So the friend was blindsided. I felt awful for having to relay that news. Grandpa was in a hospice house. He was fine. My mom went home to get a few things and come back. He passed away while she was gone. Was so hard to tell her that and hear her cry over the phone and not be able to hug her. Then had to call my grandpa's 2 sisters and tell them. Because my grandma couldn't do it. Telling my mom that her yoga instructor, a longtime family friend and man of peace Sudarman, was murdered by a religious extremist that came from another state for the sole purpose of killing him. I was only 14 at the time and struggled. BC I knew how she would react, but also she needed to know. Not me. But I used to work as a campus safety dispatcher. We had a bad ice storm one winter. And a student got in a really bad car crash. He was in critical condition in the ICU at the hospital on campus. His family was contacted and told they needed to come say their goodbyes. His grandparents arrived first. But while his parents were en route, they were in their own car crash and both died instantly. So I had to dispatch an officer to notify the grandparents of their daughter and son-in-law's death while at the bedside of their dying grandson. A large group of our friends had come together for an amazing Christmas party on the 23rd. After we woke up the next morning, my friend Mason and I were the first to find out one friend had not woken up at all. And never would again. We activated a haphazard phone tree and had to tell everyone who was at the party that Elizabeth had died in her sleep on Christmas Eve. It was shocking, tragic, and way too soon. We were 18/19 at the time. I still have a hard time on the 23rd of December. Before anyone asks, she likely died of a seizure. It was not related to the party. The only consolation is that she had a really good time with good friends on her last night with us.